March 6, 1945, Cologne, Germany. The war is already collapsing, but in the narrow streets near the cathedral, something unexpected is about to happen. A German Panther tank waits at an intersection. Its commander is not inexperienced. He has survived 3 years on the front lines. He has destroyed Shermans, outmaneuvered tank destroyers, and learned to recognize every silhouette the Americans can field. His training is precise, his instincts are sharp, and in urban combat, hesitation usually means death. Then, through the dust and broken masonry, he sees a tank approaching. At first glance, it looks American. The profile is low, the turret shape unfamiliar but not entirely alien. But something is wrong. The proportions don't match anything he knows. The gun is longer, thicker. The stance is heavier, more deliberate. It doesn't behave like a Sherman. He doesn't give the order to fire. For a split second, his mind runs through everything he has learned. German tanks are inferior in armor, inferior in firepower. That has been proven again and again. German crews rely on that advantage. It is doctrine. It is certainty. So what is this? The gunner waits for the command. The crosshairs settle. Still nothing. Because what the commander is seeing should not exist. Across the intersection, the American crew has no such doubt. Inside their tank, the situation is simple. Enemy armor, close range. Fire first. The gun erupts. In that instant, the Panther's advantage, its armor, its reputation, its dominance means nothing. The round slams into it with a force the crew has never experienced before, not at this range, not from an American tank. The hesitation is over, and so is the fight. This moment, captured on film, would later become one of the most studied tank engagements of the war. Not because it was the largest battle, not because it changed the strategic map overnight, but because it revealed something far more dangerous than a single new weapon. It exposed a blind spot. For years, German tank crews had built their confidence on a clear understanding of American capabilities. Intelligence reports, battlefield encounters, captured equipment, everything pointed to the same conclusion. American tanks were reliable, numerous, but outmatched. Their guns could not penetrate heavy German armor at long range. Their designs favored mobility and production over raw power. And that understanding was correct, until it wasn't. Because while German crews were perfecting their tactics against the Sherman, something else had been developing, quietly, slowly, and almost invisibly. A gun that could reach farther, hit harder, and change the rules of engagement entirely. The strange part is not that the weapon existed. The strange part is that it had existed for years. Back in 1942, American engineers were already working with a 90mm gun capable of engaging heavy armor at ranges previously considered unrealistic. In testing, it showed the potential to counter Germany's most feared tanks. On paper, it was exactly the kind of weapon the battlefield demanded. But paper is not the battlefield. Inside the U.S. Army, there was a different kind of conflict unfolding, not between tanks, but between ideas. Doctrine held that tanks were not meant to fight other tanks directly. That role belonged to tank destroyers. Tanks were for exploitation, maneuver, speed, and numbers, not heavier guns or thicker armor. So, even as reports from North Africa and Europe began to highlight the growing threat of German Panthers and Tigers, the response was slow, debated, delayed. The result was a gap between what was possible and what was actually deployed. By the time the new weapon finally reached the battlefield in meaningful numbers, the war was already entering its final phase. Most German crews had never encountered it. Most intelligence assessments didn't account for it, and most commanders, like the one in Cologne, had no reason to believe it was even there. That is why he hesitated. not because he lacked courage, not because he lacked experience, but because every piece of information he had told him that what he was seeing could not be real. And in war, reality doesn't wait for confirmation. The tank he faced that day was the M26 Pershing, armed with the 90-millimeter gun that had been held back for so long. It was heavier, better protected, and more powerful than the Shermans he knew. And in that brief moment at the intersection, it demonstrated exactly what it was capable of. The engagement lasted seconds, but the implications were much larger. Because this wasn't just about one tank destroying another, it was about the sudden collapse of an assumption, the realization that the enemy you thought you understood had changed, and you didn't notice. For German crews, this was more than a technical surprise. It was psychological. Their advantage had always been clear: superior guns, superior armor, superior reach. Now, without warning, that edge was gone. Worse, it was gone in a way they couldn't explain. How many of these tanks were there? Where had they been? Why hadn't they seen them before? In the chaos of the final months of the war, there were no clear answers, only encounters like this one, brief, violent, and deeply unsettling. The footage from Cologne would later be analyzed frame by frame: the timing of the shot, the angle of impact, the reaction of the Panther crew, all of it studied as evidence of a shift that had happened almost invisibly. A shift not just in firepower, but in perception. Because the most dangerous weapon on that battlefield wasn't just the gun, it was the idea that something impossible had just happened. And once that idea takes hold, it changes everything. The next time a German commander sees an unfamiliar silhouette, he doesn't hesitate. He can't afford to. But the certainty is gone, replaced by doubt, by the knowledge that somewhere out there, there may be another weapon he hasn't been told about, another gun that shouldn't exist, and this time he might not see it coming at all.
The story of that gun does not begin in Cologne. It begins years earlier, far from the battlefield, in meeting rooms, testing grounds, and quiet arguments that would decide what American soldiers would and would not take into combat. By 1942, the United States already had the foundation of a weapon that could challenge Germany's best armor. The 90-millimeter gun had proven itself in anti-aircraft roles and was showing serious promise against ground targets. In controlled tests, it demonstrated the kind of penetration and range that tank crews desperately needed. On paper, the solution was there, but war is not fought on paper. Inside the U.S. Army, there was a powerful belief shaping every decision about armored warfare. Tanks were not supposed to hunt other tanks. That mission belonged to a separate branch, the tank destroyers. Fast, mobile, heavily armed vehicles designed specifically to counter enemy armor. Tanks, on the other hand, were meant to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and move quickly across the battlefield. It was a clean theory, and like many clean theories, it didn't survive contact with reality. As American forces entered North Africa and later Italy, they began encountering German armor that didn't fit the assumptions. The Panther and the Tiger were not just defensive threats, they dominated open engagements. Their guns outranged American tanks. Their armor absorbed hits that should have been decisive. Crews adapted as best they could. They flanked, they coordinated, they relied on numbers, artillery, and air support, and often that was enough. But not always. Reports started coming in, after-action reports, crew testimonies, field commanders asking for something more powerful, something that could meet German tanks head-on and survive. The response was complicated, because accepting those reports meant admitting that the doctrine was flawed, that tanks might actually need to fight tanks, and that meant redesigning not just vehicles, but the entire way the Army thought about armored warfare. There were officers who pushed for change, engineers who argued that the technology already existed.
that the 90mm gun could be mounted on a new, heavier tank capable of matching German designs. And they were right, but they were not in control. At the highest levels, resistance remained strong. Production lines were already running. The M4 Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and could be built in massive numbers. Changing course meant slowing that production, introducing new logistical challenges, retraining crews, and risking delays in a war where timing was everything. So the argument became a trade-off: quantity versus capability, speed versus superiority. And for a long time, quantity won. The Sherman continued to roll off assembly lines by the thousands. It fought in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually across France after D-Day. It was the backbone of American armored forces, and in many ways it worked. It was dependable. It was everywhere. It kept moving. But against Panthers and Tigers, it paid a price. Crews knew it. They felt it in every engagement where they had to get closer than they wanted, expose themselves longer than they should, and rely on coordination instead of raw power to win. Meanwhile, the 90mm gun and the tank designed to carry it remained in development. The M26 Pershing was not a rushed project. It was tested, refined, debated, and delayed. Every improvement came with another discussion, another concern, another reason to wait just a little longer. By 1944, the situation in Europe had changed dramatically. American forces were pushing into heavily defended territory. Encounters with German heavy armor were increasing. The limitations of existing equipment were no longer theoretical. They were visible, documented, and impossible to ignore. Pressure began to build. Field commanders demanded better firepower. Reports became more urgent. The gap between what American tanks could do and what they needed to do was closing, but not fast enough. And still, the system resisted. Part of that resistance came from confidence, the belief that the war could be won with what was already in place, that overwhelming numbers combined with air superiority and logistics would compensate for any technical disadvantages. And in a broad sense, that belief wasn't wrong. But for the men inside those tanks, fighting at the front, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like compromise. The turning point didn't come from a single report or a single battle. It came from accumulation, from too many close calls, too many losses, too many moments where crews faced enemy armor and knew they were at a disadvantage. Eventually, the decision was made. The Pershing would go to war. But by the time that decision translated into action, by the time tanks were shipped, crews trained, and units deployed, it was early 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. German forces were retreating, but still dangerous, still capable of inflicting serious damage. And now, finally, the weapon that had been ready years earlier was arriving on the battlefield. Not in thousands, but in small numbers, carefully introduced, almost experimental. To the American crews who received them, the difference was immediate. The 90mm gun gave them reach, confidence, the ability to engage German tanks without relying entirely on maneuver or support. For the first time, they could fight on more equal terms. To the Germans, at least at first, it was invisible. Their intelligence had been thorough. Their understanding of American armor was detailed and accurate, up to a point. They knew the Sherman. They knew its strengths and weaknesses. They had built tactics around it. But they did not account for something that had been held back, something that had existed but had not been deployed in time to shape their expectations. So when the Pershing finally appeared, when its gun spoke for the first time in engagements like the one in Cologne, it didn't just introduce a new threat, it introduced confusion. Because from the German perspective, this wasn't an evolution, it was a contradiction, a break in the pattern they had come to rely on. And that made it dangerous in a different way, not just because of what it could do, but because no one was prepared for it. The delay that had frustrated American crews for years had created a strange advantage. When the weapon finally arrived, it did so without warning, without precedent, without a place in the enemy's expectations. It was, in every sense, a surprise. But it was a surprise that came with a cost. a cost measured not just in time, but in the lives of the crews who had fought without it, who had gone into battle knowing there was something better, something more capable waiting somewhere behind the lines. A weapon buried not by enemy action, but by hesitation, by debate, by the slow grinding process of an institution trying to decide what kind of war it was actually fighting. And by the time that decision was made, the war was almost over. Which raises a question that lingers long after the shooting stops. Not whether the weapon worked, but what might have happened if it had arrived sooner. By early 1945, German armored forces had something few armies ever achieve in war, a system that worked almost perfectly. Their intelligence on American armor was not guesswork. It was built on years of observation, captured vehicles, battlefield reports, and careful analysis. Every new Sherman variant was cataloged, every modification noted. Gun calibers, armor thickness, engagement ranges, all of it mapped with precision. For a Panther or Tiger commander, this knowledge was as valuable as armor. They knew how close an American tank had to get to be dangerous. They knew where to aim. They knew when they could take a hit and when they couldn't. This wasn't just experience. It was a framework, a predictable model of the enemy. And it worked. Again and again, German crews used that understanding to dominate engagements. They positioned themselves at longer ranges where their guns had the advantage. They controlled open terrain. They forced American tanks into situations where numbers were the only equalizer. Over time, this created something even more powerful than tactical superiority. It created certainty. When a Sherman appeared on the horizon, it wasn't an unknown. It was a problem with a known solution. Distance, angle, timing, these variables could be calculated. Decisions could be made quickly, confidently, without hesitation. And in combat, that confidence is everything. But certainty has a weakness. It depends on the assumption that the pattern will hold. German intelligence had become so accurate, so detailed, that it left no room for deviation. Every new piece of information was measured against what they already believed. And if something didn't fit, the instinct was not to accept it, but to question it, to dismiss it. Because a system that has been right for so long does not easily accept that it might suddenly be wrong. There were hints, of course, small anomalies, reports from scattered units describing encounters that didn't quite match expectations, occasional claims of American guns firing from longer distances than usual, impacts that felt different, stronger. But in the chaos of war, such reports are easy to explain away. Misidentification, stress, confusion. A gunner under pressure might overestimate range, a commander might misjudge distance, a damaged tank might exaggerate the power of the weapon that hit it. And so the system corrected itself. It filtered out the noise. It protected its own consistency. This is how perfect intelligence begins to fail, not by lacking information, but by rejecting the information that doesn't fit. By early 1945, German armored doctrine was not just based on data, it was built on belief, a belief reinforced by years of success, a belief that American tanks, no matter how many, would always operate within certain limits, limits that could be exploited. So when those limits were suddenly broken, the reaction was not immediate adaptation, it was hesitation. The encounter in Cologne was not unique because of the weapon alone. It was unique because of what happened before the shot was fired, the moment where recognition failed, where a trained, experienced commander saw something he could not categorize. And in that gap, in that fraction of a second, the entire system broke down. Because without recognition, there is no immediate decision, and without decision, there is no action. The Panther commander had all the tools he needed to win that engagement. His tank was powerful, his crew was trained, his position was strong. What he didn't have was a framework for what he was seeing. The silhouette didn't match, the proportions were wrong, the gun too large for what it was supposed to be. And so his mind did what it had been trained to do. It tried to resolve the contradiction, to make the unknown fit into the known, but it couldn't, and that was enough. Across the battlefield, American crews were operating under a different kind of uncertainty. They did not have the same level of detailed intelligence about German armor. They didn't rely on precise models or predictable patterns. Their approach was simpler, more direct. Identify the threat, engage, fire first. It was less refined, less calculated, but in that moment, it was faster. The introduction of the 90mm gun and the tank that carried it did more than change the balance of firepower. It disrupted the cognitive process of the enemy. It inserted doubt into a system that had no tolerance for it. Because once one assumption is proven wrong, all others become questionable. If this tank exists, what else exists? If this gun can penetrate at this range, what is safe? If the enemy has changed without warning, how do you predict what comes next? These are not questions that can be answered in the middle of a firefight. They are questions that slow decision-making, that create hesitation, that force commanders to think when they should be acting. And in armored warfare, where engagements are often decided in seconds, that delay is fatal. The German system had been built for clarity, for speed, for confidence. It excelled in an environment where variables were known and controllable, but it was not built for surprise, not this kind of surprise. The irony is that their intelligence was not wrong. It was, in many ways, flawless. It had accurately captured the reality of American armor for years. It had enabled victories, shaped tactics, and reinforced dominance. Its failure came from its success, from becoming so reliable that it no longer expected to be challenged. When the Pershing appeared, it didn't just introduce a new variable, it invalidated the model itself. And without that model, German crews were forced to rely on instinct alone, stripped of the certainty that had guided them for so long. Some adapted quickly, experience still mattered, skill still mattered, but the edge was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, uncertainty. And uncertainty in war spreads fast. One encounter becomes a rumor becomes a report becomes a warning. But by the time the system begins to adjust, by the time new intelligence is gathered, analyzed, and distributed, the damage is already done. Because the first encounters are the most dangerous. They happen in the dark, without context, without preparation. And for the crews who face them, there is no time to understand what is happening, only time to react or hesitate. And in that hesitation, the outcome is decided, not by armor thickness, not by gun caliber, but by the simple fact that one side understood the battlefield and the other no longer did.
For years, tank warfare had been defined by limits, range, armor, visibility. Every engagement unfolded within a set of understood boundaries. Crews on both sides knew them instinctively. They knew when they were safe, when they were exposed, and when a shot was worth taking. Distance was more than a number. It was a kind of protection. For German tank crews, especially those operating Panthers and Tigers, that protection was a key advantage. Their guns could reach farther, hit harder, and penetrate at distances where American tanks struggled to respond effectively. Open ground favored them. Long sight lines favored them. Time favored them. They could see first, fire first, and often end the fight before it truly began. American crews adapted to this reality. They learned to close the distance, to maneuver through cover, to coordinate with infantry, artillery, and air support. Victory came through teamwork, not superiority. It worked, but it was costly, and it required precision under pressure. Then something changed.
When the 90-millimeter gun finally entered the battlefield in a meaningful way, it didn't just add power, it altered the geometry of combat. Suddenly, distances that had once been safe were no longer safe. Engagements that once required careful maneuver could now be initiated from far beyond expected range. The invisible line that separated danger from security shifted, quietly but decisively. One engagement in particular captured this shift in a way that no report or analysis could fully explain. A long-range kill recorded at approximately 4,600 yards. At that distance, most tank crews wouldn't even consider firing, not because they lacked courage, but because the odds were too low. The variables, wind, elevation, movement, visibility, made such a shot unreliable, wasteful, impossible even. But the shot was taken, and it connected. For the crew on the receiving end, there was no warning in the way they expected, no gradual closing of distance, no sense of imminent danger, just impact, sudden and overwhelming, and far beyond what their experience had prepared them for. Moments like this don't just destroy vehicles, they destroy assumptions. Because once a crew realizes that it can be hit and penetrated at a distance it once considered safe, the entire battlefield changes. Every open field becomes a risk, every movement becomes a calculation, every pause becomes a potential target. Range is no longer a shield, it's a liability. This shift didn't happen everywhere at once. The Pershing and the 90-millimeter equipped tank destroyers were still relatively few in number, but they didn't need to be everywhere. They just needed to appear often enough to be real, often enough to be believed. In Belgium, during the final phases of the Ardennes fighting, this new reality began to take shape under pressure. A small town, expected to fall quickly under German planning, held out far longer than anticipated. Not because it was heavily fortified, not because it had overwhelming numbers, but because the defenders had something the attackers did not expect: firepower that could reach out and disrupt advances before they fully developed, guns that could engage from positions previously considered ineffective, crews who for the first time could hold ground without immediately being outmatched in a direct engagement. The timeline shifted. What was supposed to take 2 days stretched into 6, and in war, time is everything. Every additional hour allowed reinforcements to arrive, allowed defenses to stabilize, allowed plans to unravel. The German advance, already strained by logistics and resistance, began to lose momentum, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a series of small delays that accumulated into failure. This is how battlefield dynamics change, not always through massive breakthroughs, but through subtle shifts in capability that force the enemy to slow down, to reconsider, to hesitate. The 90-millimeter gun didn't win the war, but it changed the terms on which the war was being fought. It took the advantage of distance, something that had defined German armored dominance, and turned it into uncertainty. And once that happens, once the boundaries of what is possible are pushed beyond what the enemy expects, every engagement becomes a question mark, every movement a risk, every open field a potential trap. The battlefield doesn't need to be filled with these weapons. It just needs to be haunted by them. By the time the final months of the war arrived, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany was losing ground on every front. Cities were collapsing into rubble. Supply lines were breaking. And yet, in isolated pockets, the fighting remained as lethal and unforgiving as ever. It is in one of those moments, brief, violent, and almost clinical, that the full impact of this weapon becomes clear. Not in theory, not in reports, but in 46 seconds of film. The footage is grainy, silent, and distant. An American tank moves cautiously through the streets of Cologne. The ruins of the city rise around it, broken stone and shattered walls, framing a battlefield that was never meant for armor. Somewhere ahead, a German Panther waits, positioned to ambush anything that enters its line of fire. Two machines, two crews, both trained, both experienced, both aware that whoever fires first will likely decide the outcome. Inside the American tank, the gunner is 21 years old. He is not a veteran of years of combat. He does not carry the accumulated certainty of doctrine or long experience. What he has is training, discipline, and a weapon that, until recently, most crews like his never had. The distance closes. The Panther remains hidden, angled for a shot. Its commander has the advantage of position, but not of clarity. He knows the Americans are advancing. He expects a Sherman. He expects a familiar silhouette, a predictable engagement. What he sees instead forces a delay. Not long, just enough. The American tank stops. The turret begins to traverse. The gunner searches, adjusts, settles. There is no dramatic pause, no visible hesitation, only the quiet mechanical precision of a crew doing exactly what it has been trained to do. Find the target, fire. The first shot breaks the silence. It strikes, but the Panther is not yet destroyed. Its armor holds, partially. The engagement is still alive. Seconds pass. Inside both vehicles, time compresses. Every movement is immediate, every decision final. The American gunner reloads, adjusts, fires again. This time, the result is decisive. The Panther erupts, its internal space turned into a violent, contained explosion. The advantage it once held, its armor, its gun, its reputation, collapses in an instant. The fight is over before it can fully unfold. 46 seconds. That is all it takes. For the crew inside the American tank, the moment is just another engagement, another target, another confirmation that their weapon works as intended. There is no time to reflect, no sense of historical significance, only the next movement, the next street, the next threat. But for those who would later study this footage, the meaning is much larger, because this is not just a kill, it is a demonstration. A demonstration of what happens when a system finally delivers the tool it was capable of producing all along. When the gap between potential and reality is closed, too late to change the entire course of the war, but just in time to reveal what had been missing. The 90mm gun did not create better soldiers. It gave existing soldiers a different set of possibilities. And in doing so, it changed the nature of the decisions they could make. The gunner in that tank did not need to outmaneuver the Panther. He did not need to rely on overwhelming numbers or external support. He needed only a clear line of sight and the confidence that his weapon could do the rest. That confidence is not abstract, it is measurable, in seconds, in outcomes, in survival. For German crews, moments like this carried a different weight. Each unexpected loss, each encounter with a weapon that did not fit their understanding, chipped away at something less visible than armor. Trust. Trust in their knowledge. Trust in their expectations. Trust in the system that had guided them through years of combat. And once that trust begins to erode, it does not fail all at once. It fades, slowly, then suddenly. A commander who once acted without hesitation now pauses, just briefly, to confirm what he is seeing. A gunner who once trusted his range now questions it. A crew that once advanced with confidence now moves with caution. These changes are small, individually almost insignificant, but together they alter the outcome of engagements before the first shot is even fired. This is the part of war that is rarely visible. Not the explosion, not the impact, not the destruction, but the moment before, the decision, the fraction of a second where action is either taken or delayed. In Cologne, that fraction of a second belonged to one side, and it made all the difference. The lesson is not about a single tank or a single battle. It is about the structure behind them, the decisions made far from the front lines, the debates, the delays,
the priorities that determine what reaches the battlefield and when. Because the weapon that ended that engagement in 46 seconds was not new, it was not experimental, it was not a last-minute innovation born of desperation. It was a capability that had existed in one form or another for years, held back, debated, delayed, and then finally released into a war that was already nearing its conclusion. This is where the story turns, away from the battlefield and towards something less visible but far more decisive: institutions. Armies do not fight as individuals, they fight as systems, complex, layered, and often slow to change. The effectiveness of a soldier is shaped not just by skill or courage, but by the tools they are given and the timing with which those tools arrive. A superior weapon delivered too late becomes a lesson instead of an advantage. A flawed decision repeated long enough becomes doctrine, and doctrine, once established, resists change, even when reality demands it. The American Army eventually corrected its course. It recognized the need, deployed the weapon, and demonstrated its effectiveness. But the delay carried a cost, one that cannot be measured solely in territory or timelines. It is measured in moments like this, moments where a different decision, made earlier, might have changed not just the outcome of a single engagement, but the experience of thousands of crews who fought without that advantage. In the end, wars are not won by a single shot or a single machine. They are won by the alignment of decisions, technical, strategic, institutional, that determine what is possible on the battlefield. The 46 seconds in Cologne are not the story of victory. They are the story of a rival, of a weapon that proved in less than a minute what it had been capable of all along, and of a war that, for one side, ran out of time to fully understand what had just changed.